The porcelain cup shattered against the marble floor, echoing to the Pierce mansion like thunder. Little Ava Pierce, barely 6, stood red-faced and trembling, clutching another cup in her small white hands. Across from her, Imani, a black housekeeper in her 30s, didn't flinch. She simply lowered her gaze, calm even as sharp porcelain pieces cut across her wrist. "Get out!" Ava screamed. "You don't belong here." Her tiny voice shook the chandeliers above them. Imani pressed a folded napkin against her bleeding wrist, her tone soft, the kind that disarms storms. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart." The child's eyes filled with rage. "Don't call me that. You're just the maid." But behind those angry tears, Imani saw something else. Loneliness, the kind that screamed louder than any insult ever could. She exhaled slowly, holding the girl's stare. "I'm here to help you eat, sleep, and remember you're still loved, even when you don't believe it." Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ethan Pierce, Ava's father, a billionaire who measured compassion in profit margins, appeared in the doorway. "What's going on?" he demanded. Ava ran into his arms, pointing at Imani. "She hit me." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. "Is that true?" Blood still dripping, Imani shook her head. "No, sir." She threw the cup. "It cut me. I didn't touch her." "Enough," he snapped. "You've been here one day. I won't tolerate chaos." Ava buried her face into his chest, her tears convenient, practiced. Imani stood still, the truth silenced not by guilt, but by position. She whispered only to herself, "Sometimes the truth doesn't make a sound." He turned coldly. "Pack your things." Imani nodded once, her dignity unbroken, and walked away, leaving small drops of red on the white marble. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. The morning light slipped through the tall mansion windows, soft and golden, touching everything except the people inside. In the quiet staff kitchen, Imani sat alone, her wrist now bandaged, her face calm but unreadable. The head housekeeper avoided eye contact. The others whispered, pretending not to. Upstairs, the world was different. Marble, perfume, and framed smiles had long stopped being real. Ethan Pierce, the billionaire widower, scrolled through stock reports like the world hadn't just turned upside down in his own house. Grief was something he managed the same way he managed money, by not looking at it too long. Meanwhile, Ava, his daughter, refused breakfast again. She sat at the piano, tiny hands pressing one key over and over. The note rang hollow. Her mother, gone only months, had played that same key whenever she felt nervous. Now, the sound just haunted the walls. Downstairs, Imani tied her apron again, ignoring the ache in her wrist. She wasn't there for pity. She'd worked tougher homes before, places where being a black woman meant swallowing pride to keep a paycheck. But this house was different. The silence felt alive, like it was testing her. When Mrs. Given, the head housekeeper, walked in, her tone was clipped. "Mr. Pierce said you can stay until the agency finds a replacement." Imani nodded. Understood. She didn't say thank you. Gratitude was wasted on temporary mercy. She started cleaning the dining hall, the same room where she'd been humiliated last night. The scent of lemon polish filled the air, but beneath it lingered something heavier, judgment. Her eyes fell on a framed photo on the piano. Ethan's late wife, Sophia, smiling with Ava on her lap. They both had the same blue eyes. And behind them, in the blurred background, a young woman stood holding a tray, the same eyes Imani had seen in her own reflection once before. She froze. Her mother used to tell her stories of a family she never met, of a father who lived in New York, rich, powerful, unreachable. She thought they were fairy tales. Now she wasn't so sure. As she dusted the frame, a small violet cloth fell from behind it. Her breath caught. It was embroidered with initials, S.C. Sophia Campbell. Imani's heart sank. Her mother's maiden name was Campbell, too. She folded the cloth quietly and slipped it into her pocket. For the first time since arriving, she looked around that cold mansion and whispered, "Maybe I was meant to be here after all." The next evening, the mansion buzzed with tension thick enough to feel in the air. Dinner was supposed to be formal. Long table, silver cutlery, and silence sharp enough to cut through glass. Imani moved carefully between seats, serving plates, pretending not to notice the way the other maids watched her like she was already fired. Ava sat stiff beside her father, picking at her food. When Imani leaned close to place a napkin, the girl flinched dramatically and whispered, "Don't touch me." The words weren't loud, but they were perfectly timed. Ethan looked up. "Ava, enough," he said, though his tone wasn't defense. It was warning. Minutes passed before the storm returned. The girl suddenly cried out, clutching her arm. "She hurt me again. She grabbed me." Everyone froze. The clink of silver stopped. Imani stepped back, stunned. "That's not true." Ava's eyes flooded with tears, trembling like she practiced it 100 times. "She said I was a spoiled brat," she sobbed. The staff murmured, the kind of noise that spreads like smoke. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Imani, my daughter is injured. Are you calling her a liar?" "No, sir," Imani said quietly, her voice steady even as her heart raced. But she scratched herself on the chair. "I saw it." He slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. I said no more chaos in this house." Ava hid behind his arm, sobbing harder, and Imani felt the weight of years pressing down, the same pattern, the same disbelief, the same punishment for being the wrong color in the wrong room. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Instead, she took a slow breath, then removed the white towel from her shoulder. A deep red mark still cut across her wrist from the shattered cup. "Sometimes, sir," she said softly, "the one who bleeds isn't the one who's believed." Ethan froze for a second, but pride overruled logic. "You'll get your payment for the week. Leave by morning." The room was silent again. Even Mrs. Given, who'd been smirking quietly in the corner, avoided Imani's eyes. Imani turned toward the door, but halfway through the hall, she stopped. Something on the wall caught her attention. A small black glass circle she hadn't noticed before. A security camera. She stared at it, realization flickering behind her eyes. If this house was what it seemed, everything, every lie, every accusation, might already be recorded. That night, while the mansion slept, she slipped into study. The security monitor glowed faintly in the dark. Her hands trembled as she replayed the last 12 hours. There was Ava throw her plate first, the chair scraping, the self-inflicted scratch, the crocodile tears. The truth. Imani exhaled, tears finally falling for the first time since she'd arrived. She whispered to the empty room, "Justice doesn't always come from people. Sometimes it comes from proof." She saved the footage to a drive, tucked it into her pocket, and walked back toward her small quarters with her head high. Tomorrow, they'd all see it. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. Morning sunlight crept through the tall windows, hitting the same marble floor where everything had started. Imani stood quietly beside Ethan's study desk, her uniform pressed, the flash drive resting between them like silent proof. He played the footage twice. The crash, the lie, the blood, and finally, the truth. A long silence filled the room before he finally exhaled. "I owe you an apology." Imani kept her gaze low. "You don't owe me anything, sir. Just a chance to keep doing my job." Ethan leaned back, guilt hiding behind pride. "You could have taken this to the agency. You could have ruined us." "I didn't come here to ruin anyone," she said softly. "I came here to work and maybe help a little girl remember what love sounds like." For a second, the billionaire had no words. He only nodded. "You can stay." When Imani stepped out of the study, she found Ava sitting at the top of the staircase, knees tucked under her chin. The girl's eyes darted away, pretending she hadn't been listening, but her trembling gave her away. That afternoon, Imani passed by the piano room. The same haunting key echoed again, but this time it wasn't angry, just lost. Imani paused at the doorway. "That song, your mother used to play it?" Ava didn't answer, so Imani hummed, quietly, perfectly in tune. The same melody, slower, like a memory being stitched back together. The child froze. Her hand stopped shaking. She whispered, "How do you know that song?" Imani smiled faintly. "My mother taught it to me. She said her sister played it for her once, long ago." Ava turned, eyes wide. "My mom's sister died before I was born." Imani's throat tightened, but she didn't correct her. Not yet. She simply said, "Maybe she didn't." For the first time since Sophia's funeral, Ava smiled, barely, but real. And as sunlight poured through the tall windows, the mansion finally felt less like a museum and more like a home trying to remember warmth. The rain had returned. Thin, silver lines streaking down the mansion, windows like the house itself was grieving. Imani polished the dining table in silence, her mind replaying a single thought she'd buried for years. Sophia Campbell, her mother's sister. Upstairs, Ethan was on a call, pacing his office. His voice cut through the air, calm, rehearsed, professional. But beneath that, there was something else now, doubt. The kind that doesn't leave once it's born. When the call ended, Imani appeared at the door holding the folded violet cloth she'd found behind Sophia's photo. "Sir, may I ask where Mrs. Pierce came from originally?" He looked up, puzzled. "Georgia." "Why?" Imani's chest tightened. "My mother, Ruth Campbell. She was from Georgia, too." Ethan froze, his brow furrowed. "That name!" Sophia mentioned a Ruth once. Said she was her father's mistake. Imani's voice trembled. She was his first daughter. "And I'm hers." For a moment, Ethan just stared, as if trying to rearrange the world in front of him. "So you're saying..." "I'm saying Sophia was my half-sister, and Ava is my niece." Silence. Heavy, cold, unbreathing. He stood, stepping closer, searching her face. "Why didn't you say this before?" "Because I didn't come here for your family name," she said quietly. "I came because a little girl was crying in a house full of people pretending not to hear her." Ethan's hands fell to his sides. Guilt began to show, not loud, but visible in his eyes. "My wife never told me," he whispered. "She didn't need to," Imani replied. "Love doesn't always need a bloodline to prove it." The door creaked open. Ava stood there, eyes wide, her rabbit toy clutched tight. "Your family?" she asked. Imani knelt slowly, her voice soft. "By heart first, by blood later." Ava's lip quivered. So Mama wasn't lying when she said angels come back looking different? Tears welled in Imani's eyes. Maybe she was right. The little girl dropped her rabbit and ran forward, wrapping her arms around Imani's neck. For the first time, Ethan didn't pull her away. He turned to the window, rain still falling, whispering to himself, "Maybe the truth hurts less when it finally feels right." The next morning broke quiet, but the silence felt different. Heavy, watchful. Ethan sat at the breakfast table, unread newspaper folded, eyes distant. Across from him, Ava hummed the same song again, the one Imani had taught her to finish. Something in that sound healed a corner of the house. But not everyone liked it. Mrs. Given, the head housekeeper, watched in the doorway, her expression sharp. She'd worked in this house for 20 years, and no one had ever unsettled her order like this new woman had. When she spoke, her words dripped sweetly with poison. "Sir, I thought you should know." The staff's been talking. The maid's been overstepping. Ethan didn't look up. "Her name is Imani, and she's staying." That single sentence cracked the air open. Given's lips tightened. "As you wish." Later that afternoon, Imani noticed something strange. The small black camera in the corner of the study was blinking, recording. She hadn't turned it on. Curious, she checked the system again that night. Hidden folders, unauthorized access. Someone else had been recording them. Not security, but surveillance. She clicked through files until one made her blood run cold. A video dated the week of Sophia's funeral. A man's hand reaching into a velvet-lined violin case. The same violin Ava said belonged to her mother. The face came into view just long enough to see it clearly. Harold Wexley, Ethan's business partner. Sophia's trusted friend. Imani's chest tightened. He had stolen the one thing Ava loved most. And if he'd taken that, what else had he taken? When Ethan saw the footage, his hands trembled against the desk. He was here the week after the funeral. He said quietly, I trusted him. Imani's voice was calm. Then it's time he learns what trust costs. That evening, Ethan called a meeting, just him, Wexley, and Imani standing silently in the corner. The man laughed it off at first. A violin? You can't be serious. Ethan slid a photo across the desk. Wexley's hand froze in mid-theft. The laughter died. You betrayed my wife's memory, Ethan said, and you watched my child suffer for your greed. For the first time, Wexley stuttered. I was keeping it safe. Imani's eyes narrowed. Then why sell it 3 months later under a false name? Silence. Then Ethan's voice cold final. You're done. You'll pay back every cent. And you'll never come near this family again. Wexley left without a word. Outside, thunder rolled through the city, as if the storm itself had been waiting for that truth to break free. Imani stood by the window, watching rain slide down the glass. Behind her, Ava whispered, Did we win? Imani smiled softly. Winning isn't always loud, sweetheart. Sometimes it's just being believed. The morning after the storm was bright, sunlight spilling through clean glass, chasing shadows from every corner of the Pierce mansion. For the first time in months, laughter echoed down the hallway. Small, fragile, but real. Ava sat at the piano again, her rabbit toy beside her, humming the same melody that had once haunted the house. Now it sounded like peace. Imani entered quietly, a fresh bouquet in her hands. She placed it in a vase near the window, glancing back at the little girl. You remember the notes, she said softly. Ava smiled without looking up. You taught me to listen first. Ethan Pierce appeared at the doorway, dressed for work but slower, humbler somehow. His voice carried none of the sharpness it once did. He looked at Imani for a long moment before speaking. There's something I need to say. Imani turned, wiping her hands on her apron. You don't have to, sir. I do. His tone cracked slightly. You came here as a stranger and ended up saving my daughter and me. I can't undo my mistakes, but I can start by giving you the respect you've earned. She nodded, her eyes calm. That's all I ever wanted. Respect and a chance to stay. You're not staff anymore, he said quietly. You're family. Sophia would have wanted it that way. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The sunlight caught on a violet cloth folded near the piano. Sophia's initials still stitched into it. Imani smiled faintly. Then let's make sure Ava knows she came from love, not legacy. Ethan nodded. Ava climbed off the bench and took Imani's hand. Can we play Mama's song again? Imani knelt beside her. Only if you promise to play the last note. Ava grinned. Together? Always. The piano filled the room with the softest harmony. 2 hands, 1 melody, and the ghost of grief finally at rest. Outside, the rain-washed sky turned gold. Inside, the mansion finally breathed again. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.